Good evening, everyone. How is everyone doing?
Good.
Great. So good to be back in my adopted home once again. Thank you for continuing to welcome me here. And I actually brought a friend along tonight. Friend and colleague Dr. Fran Kaplan is here with us. So you all have heard me talk about our virtual museum, our online museum. That is the person that's responsible for coming up with that wonderful idea and creating it and making all of the updates. She's just a phenomenal woman. My daughter calls her fantastic. And it absolutely fits. So she is here. She has copies of our founder, Dr. James Cameron's memoirs, A Time of Terror, that she's selling this evening. And we also have a list if you want to get on our mailing list as well. So I'm going to get started with the presentation. I'm here tonight to talk about the wonderful story of Joshua Glover. I think it's the second time I've done the presentation here. I've added some additional information based on some research that a couple of my colleagues at the museum did. Fascinating story that they discovered, which is a little known part of Milwaukee's history. I'm going to share that with you. So before we get to that though, I want to share with you that is the Virtual Museum's website. My email address is right underneath that. And as some of you may know, the physical museum closed in 2008, and we are in the process now of opening a new physical museum out with the old. That building is nearly completely, it's probably completely torn down by now. Last week I drove by, it was 95% gone. And this is what the new one will look like. So we're anxiously awaiting the day that happens. We should be reopening in about a year's time. We'll be part of a development that's taking place there. It'll be right on the footprint of the old museum. And we're excited about the opportunity to be the people that occupy the commercial space on the first floor of that building. The floors above us will be mixed income housing. So it's a development that's taken 2.5 years to create. It's been a very complicated negotiations with a lot of different parties involved, and we're very excited to be a part of that. So I want to share with you just some words about the museum and the founder. And Dr. Cameron, most people aren't aware that Dr. Cameron started the museum. He first opened it at the age of 74. 74 years old when he opened the museum, and he lived a fascinating life. And he touched a lot of people along the way, but I think he touched way more people after he turned the age of 74 than he ever did before that. And it's just an absolutely fascinating story, this museum that he created and why he created it. If you go to the museum's website, our virtual museum, you can find out more of the details about that. But I wanted to just share a few words with you about the importance of the museum and the work that we do on behalf of the museum, the work that we do following the footsteps of Dr. Cameron. More than ever, our nation needs the healing vision of Dr. James Cameron, the museum's founder. He dreamed of our nation as one single and sacred nationality and believed we could achieve a just and peaceful society through education and empathy building. Dr. Cameron's vision is as relevant and compelling today as it was when he survived a 1930 lynching at the age of 16. Our new space will serve as a place where people from our city and visitors around the world can experience and dialogue about African American history as an integral part of American history. And one of the things that I say a lot when I do talks of this nature is that we have to understand that this history that we're talking about it's American history. It's not African American history, it's American history. We have these hyphenated names we use to describe one another. We place people into different groups and we talk about their history as if it's separate, but it's all part of American history. Some of it is good, some of it isn't so good, but it's just as important to learn those things that aren't so positive as it is to learn the things that we celebrate. So we're going to celebrate the founding fathers. We have to also acknowledge that most of them were owners of black men, women, and children during the course of their lives, including the first president, George Washington, who owned over 300 black people during the course of his life, most of whom he acquired because he married well. He wasn't a very wealthy man. He married into a wealthy family. Martha's family was very wealthy, and so that's a part of American history. But we're here to kind of talk about, a fascinating thing that happened right here in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has had a history for most of its history as being a place that set itself apart from the rest of the nation by being kind of a very liberal-minded place, a very progressive state in many ways. So a lot of very progressive policies that spread throughout the rest of the country actually were tested here in Wisconsin. And so for most of our history, up until the last several years or so, we've been a pioneer in progressive movements in Wisconsin, and it's reflected in the events about Joshua Glover that we're going to talk about tonight. People from around the country aren't familiar with the Joshua Glover story. Many of us in this region don't know the story, so I'm here to share that with you tonight. And we're going to talk about the heroic rescue of Joshua Glover in 1854, but we're also going to talk about what followed 7 years later, is a lynching of a black man in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we recently discovered the details of this, and we're working to actually create a memorial to that lynching in Milwaukee. We've created an exhibit on our museum's website, which I'll show you very shortly, which talks about those events, and they juxtapose the Joshua Glover story with the events of Mr. Clark's demise. So it's fascinating to see how a community that celebrated for this heroic act turned its back and did something deplorable just 7 years later. So we'll talk about both of those tonight. This is the page on our virtual museum where you can find the exhibit. We call it, How Does a City Choose to Remember Its Past? And so if you go to the museum's website, if you go and you do some exploration, you can come across this page and really learn the story of Joshua Glover and how we look at that in comparison to what happened to Mr. Clark. It's a fascinating journey through tumultuous time in the nation's history in the 1850s. Tumultuous time in Wisconsin's history. Milwaukee was a fairly new city at that time. Racine was a very young city at the time. And, we kind of stood out in many ways because we as a state stood up to the federal government's policies and said that we don't care if that's your policy. We don't believe in it, and we're going to do something about it. And so part of the Joshua Glover experiences was the state of Wisconsin standing up to the federal as well as the state government and mandating that the state say, you know what, we don't believe in this Fugitive Slave Act at all. We're going to show you how we feel about it. So that's the story of Joshua Glover exhibit on our website, and it tells the story of his capture as well as his rescue. And it also tells the story of the lynching of Mr. Clark as well, which we'll cover at the end of the presentation. So how many of you, by a show of hands, have been to the Virtue Museum? Okay, great. Keep going back. We're constantly adding additional exhibits. We are up to 2,900 exhibit pages on the museum's website. We've been visited by practically every nation on the planet, with the exception of just a handful. We had in the last calendar year 1.5 million visitors to the website. It's been a joy to see the responses that we've gotten from people who visit it and use it as a resource, teachers, students, interested parties around the world. One of our exhibits, our exhibit on Jim Crow segregation, which is written by one of our board members and one of our scholar griots who writes most of the exhibits for the museum, has actually been adopted in Germany, and they're actually using that exhibit to teach part of American history in German classrooms as we speak. So we're very, very proud of that accomplishment. That's the most popular exhibit on our website. In fact, people are always interested in learning the history of Jim Crow. So there are a lot of things on the museum's website you can see. So please, if you've been to the website, go back, learn more, And if you haven't been, please go and share that with friends, family members, co-workers, strangers, enemies, everybody. All right, Joshua Glover. So he escaped slavery in Missouri in 1852 and came to Racine, Wisconsin after a treacherous journey, escaping this condition that he was not happy with, living with for a majority of his life. And so he came to Racine and lived as a free man, working at a sawmill, and had a small cabin that he lived in. And you know, even though he was in a free state that wasn't a slave state, he always had a certain level of fear that could end at any given moment. And so even though he came and he was embraced by the community and became good friends with many people in the community, an outstanding member of the Racine community, there was always in the back of his mind that fear that at any given moment that could all change. And unfortunately, it did change. So he was captured on March 10th of 1854. He was in his cabin about 4 miles outside of town, and his former owner and the U.S. Marshal came, and they captured him and put him in handcuffs and traveled to Milwaukee and put him in the jail in Milwaukee. And so that moment that he had feared for many, many years finally came to be. And you know, even though it's a very sad story that it happened, that he was captured, it was very common for this to happen. When blacks would find the means and the methods and the wherewithal to escape slavery in the South, they would, in many cases, be forced back there. And in many cases, blacks who were never even enslaved would be captured and forced into servitude themselves. So it was a journey that he took because he felt that it was necessary to gain his freedom. But he always knew that this moment could possibly happen. So the picture that you're seeing is actually a picture of the Milwaukee jail at that time that he was taken to and held captive after he had been captured. And it was perfectly legal for them to do this. You know, federal law mandated that any fugitive should be captured and should be returned to their rightful owner. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how those laws worked and the role that the U.S. Constitution played in this. I've always tell people that, you know, we all know about the U.S. Constitution, but we really, you know, we haven't really read it. You know, we've read about it, but very few people have actually read the document. It's a fascinating document, and one of the things that fascinates me about it more than anything else is that it hasn't changed. We've made additions to it. We have never taken anything out of the Constitution. Most people aren't aware of that. People think that stuff that was in it about slavery, they took that out. No, they didn't. It's still there. We just amended it. And so we used to amend it on a fairly regular basis. It's been a while since we've had a constitutional amendment. But all of these stipulations that were directly related to the enslavement of African people in this country, they're still in the Constitution. And most of us are unaware how many parts of the Constitution were directly related to the enslavement of African people. I've counted there are no less than 10 different components of the Constitution that are directly related to the enslavement of African people. Many of the amendments that we hold a great deal of pride in, the amendment that allows us to carry weapons and defend ourselves, was a direct relationship to the enslavement of African people. When they talked about the right to bear arms as part of a militia, the militias were there simply to protect white citizens from the fear of slave revolts. And so that is why it's in the Constitution, not because they wanted people to be able to buy an AR-15 assault rifle and go into a school and shoot people with it. It was because they wanted able-bodied white men in particular to have the right to bear arms as part of those militias, which would protect their communities from the enslaved African population, which they were in constant fear of. So let's look at a little background on the legal part of this. So The Constitution was written in 1787, and Article 4, Section 2 was a big part of why Joshua Glover ended up being captured. So we're going to look at the text of that. It says that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. One of the fascinating things about our Constitution and the Founding Fathers that I don't think people really think much about is, and I say this because it's absolutely the truth, they were hypocrites. They were afraid to put the word slave and slavery in the Constitution, and they never did. So they found fancy ways of describing slavery. They found fancy words to describe those whom they enslaved, because they knew that they were founding this nation built on freedom, liberty, and justice for all, yet they were enslaving millions of people at the same time they did that. So when you read the Constitution, you find these wonderful words: no person held to service or labor. That's their way of saying a slave. That's what it means. It's some fancy words that mean slave. Under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation be discharged from such service or labor. So they're basically saying that just because you leave a state where slavery is legal and you move to a state where it is illegal, you're still enslaved according to the Fugitive Slave Law, which was this part of the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause. So as you read the Constitution, and you know, if you're really bored late at night and you want something to help you get to sleep, just pull out a copy of the Constitution. It'll put you to sleep in a short period of time. But it's very interesting because the word slave was first used in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That was in 1865. So nearly 100 years after the original Constitution was written was the first time the word slave was written. And what I found very interesting was when the Confederate States were formed in 1861, they broke away. Those 11 of the 15 slaving states broke away and formed the Confederate States of America. And they had their own president, Jefferson Davis. They had their own Senate, their own House of Representatives, their own Constitution. And I have to give them some credit. They were bad people, but they did something that the U.S. government didn't do. They were honest about slavery. When they were talking about the slaves, they wrote slave in the Constitution. When they were talking about slavery, they wrote the word slavery. They were very honest. Much more so than the Founding Fathers, because they weren't ashamed of that institution. And so when you look at the Constitution and you look at how we describe those people who were enslaved, had you not known this history, let's just say a spaceship landed 20 years from now and somehow miraculously they knew English. I'm always amazed at how these movies about space travel, they go to planets and people speak English on these other planets. I don't know how that happens when you cross the ocean and people don't speak English. So it's amazing. But had some spaceship landed here on Earth 20 years from now and they just picked up the Constitution and they read everything up to the 13th Amendment, they would never know that slavery existed in the country as a legal institution, because the word just isn't there. So it's a very interesting way to look at the Constitution. So 1787 Northwest Ordinance was passed, and it played a really important role because it applied the fugitive slave rule to the free territories. So as the nation was expanding out to the west, people wanted to make sure that, well, we can't let our slaves just escape out to the west and not have consequences of being forced to come home. So this act was passed in 1787. The Northwest Ordinance required people to turn these escaped individuals in, just as they would be if they were from a regular state. And so 1793, a Fugitive Slave Law was passed, and it only required proof of ownership for capture, and it led to increased kidnapping of free blacks. So this requirement of proof of ownership, so a white person could come with a document that purported that they owned this African man, woman, or child, and that would be all they would need to take this person, capture them, and take them back with them. Now, there was no real way of legitimizing whether or not these credentials were correct or not. In many cases they were falsified, and in most cases they probably didn't ask either way. How many of you have seen the movie 20 Years a Slave? I mean, that's a perfect example of how this situation, the Fugitive Slave Clause, was used. This free man who had lived a free life was captured and forced into slavery against his will, and there was really nothing that he could do about it for most of that time. So we took the Constitution and we embedded a few other laws to make the institution of the Fugitive Slave Clause, made it more powerful. We extended it further than it had been before. And so that played a really, really important role in the story of Joshua Glover. So let's look at the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which was passed. And it really was passed at a time where there was great debate about slavery itself as an institution. You know, we were having great debates in the houses of Congress. We were having great debates in state houses around the country about the institution of slavery and whether or not it would extend into new states, whether or not it would extend into new territories as the nation was growing. And one of the things that just kept coming up was, well, what do we do about the fugitives? What do we do if they escape? How do we handle this? And so this very, very strict law, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, was passed, and it gave court commissioners the same power as judges. So if you were a court commissioner, you could act as a judge in the cases of fugitives. And so slave owners issued claim certificates by these court commissioners. So they would go to a court, they would claim that a person that they owned escaped and they wanted them back, and they would get this claim certificate and they could go and search for this person. And once they found them, they had the proper credentials to arrest that person and then take them back to wherever they chose to take them back to. And so around the country, one of the occupations that developed and became a very prominent part of American history, but we really don't talk about it, were actually people who were just working simply to recapture fugitives. That was their job. They were very, very good at it. They learned methods of tracking these individuals. They learned who the people were in the community that would be receptive to helping those people. They organized networks of people who would be what the children nowadays would call snitches. And they became very good at tracking down these people. So let's imagine this. I grew up in the first 7 years of my life, well, 6 of the first 7. I lived in Mississippi, little town in Mississippi, Charleston, Mississippi. Not much special about Charleston. I call it the great state of Mississippi because I'm from there. That's the only thing that makes it great. Not a lot of redeeming qualities in that state, unfortunately. I love the state, though. I love the people in Mississippi. I just don't like the state of Mississippi. Wonderful people there, though. But imagine, Milwaukee is 700 miles from my hometown in Mississippi. And imagine had my family, who were owned by a man by the name of Dempsey Dilts, traced my family's history, and I was able to discover the owner of my family on my grandmother's side, my mother's side of the family. And imagine if one of those individuals had actually tried to escape to the north, and they wanted to come and follow in the footsteps of Joshua Glover and come to Racine. And they would have had to travel 600 and some odd miles to get here. Imagine the difficulty of that at that time when transportation, I mean, it wasn't like they could call up an Uber and say, come pick me up, or, you know, in the tree over by the river. That was going to be a very, very difficult journey. And one of the things that people who were enslaved in those states that were the northern parts of the slave territory, states like Kentucky, Tennessee, they feared being sold down the river. And when they said they were going to sell you down the river, what that meant was that they were going to sell you to the lower south, as far south as you could get. So your chances of escaping successfully would be much more difficult. In many of the cases when fugitives were captured, instead of them being taken back to their owner, the owner said they're too much trouble, I'll sell them, and they were typically sold further south so that their means of escape would be much more difficult moving forward. So the journey that Joshua Glover took from St. Louis was a journey of about almost 300 miles versus what would have been nearly 700 miles had my relatives attempted to escape to the north. In addition to that, all federal marshals were ordered to carry out the orders of these commissioners. So every federal marshal in the nation was required to follow the lead of these commissioners, who weren't judges, but they were given the rights and the responsibilities and the power of judges. So all federal marshals had to follow whatever they said on these claim certificates. And so if you were non-compliant, there was a fine of $1,000. Now imagine this is 1850. $1,000 was a whole lot of money back at that time. A tremendous amount of money. And someone asked me once, so why was the fine so heavy? Why was it so high? They had to put a mechanism in place that was forceful enough that scared people into not complying with it. And most people, I mean, they wouldn't make $1,000 in a year if they tried. You know, incomes are way lower than that. And so if you were to get slammed with a $1,000 fine, oh my goodness, that would just be devastating to you. And so they put that fine in place in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, specifically to make it so that people would, you know, be afraid of not being compliant with that law. So it played a big role. It increased the penalties from the constitutional documents, which stated that it was illegal to you know, help these people and that you had to turn them in. Now they put a mechanism in place that really slammed you hard penalty-wise if you didn't comply. So the Fugitive Slave Law also made marshals liable for the full value of those who escaped. So let's just assume that the marshals went out and they were tracking a particular individual and they captured the individual and somehow that individual escaped. Well, guess what? You captured them, you're now responsible. You bought it, you broke it, you pay for it. And so they were not going to be the type of people that were going to, you know, let this happen very easily. So they were fully liable for the value of that person. Now, if by coincidence, if they captured this individual and they were taking them back to St. Louis or to Charleston, South Carolina, wherever it may be, and this individual died while they had them in custody, they were liable for that as well. So whatever the value of that individual was, they would have to pay the owner of that person. If they killed the person during the course of the pursuit, they would be liable for this as well. So in many cases, what they would do is if they were in pursuit of a person and somehow they accidentally caused that person to die, and they would simply pretend that they never found them. We did our best. We tracked them as far north as we could, and we just lost the trail in the Ohio River. And, you know, they would lie because they were not going to be liable for paying for that person. And so that was kind of the way things worked. In addition to that, the fugitives could not testify in court. So just as you saw in 20 Years a Slave, this man was trying to testify that he was never enslaved, but he couldn't testify in court. It was against the law. He was labeled a fugitive by those court commissioners, and whether he was a fugitive or not, whether he was a free person or not, once they said he was a fugitive, he had no rights to testify on his behalf in court. So you had no chance really of defending your right to go back as a free person, because once you were labeled a fugitive, whether or not you were one or not, it didn't matter. And even if you were a fugitive and you were trying to testify on your behalf and saying that, well, I'm now in a free state, I should be given my freedom, you would not be able to say that in a court of law in the country. There was a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail for harboring, aiding, or abetting a fugitive. That was incredible that people were willing to say, you know what, I know the penalties are harsh, but I'm going to help people anyway. I'm going to help them. I think that these people should get their freedom. And so the Underground Railroad, all those people that were involved in the Underground Railroad, those thousands of people around the country, black as well as white, as well as Native Americans who harbored them as well, these people risked time in jail and a tremendous fine to assist these individuals. If they were caught, they would not be lenient with them, because one of the things that made this law so harshly debated across the country, especially in the freer states, people said that we don't believe that it's right that these individuals should be held in bondage to begin with, and once they've escaped that bondage, then you should just leave them alone. If you wanted to hold on to them as an enslaved person, you should have done a better job of making sure they didn't escape. These were the arguments people made. And nevertheless, if you were caught harboring these people, helping them, assisting them in any way, you could easily be fined and thrown in jail. But people risked that in many places, including here in Racine, as we'll see. Commissioners were paid $5 if no certificate was issued, and $10 for a certificate authorizing return. So imagine you're one of these court commissioners and you're going to get paid $5 or $10. So if you don't issue a certificate, you get $5. If you do issue a certificate, you get $10. Which one do you think you're going to do? You're going to take the $5 or the $10? You're probably going to take the $10 one. And each person that they bring before you is going to put money into your pocket. So guess what? The people that are the ones who are out chasing these fugitives, as they call them, are going to build relationships with these court commissioners around the country. They're going to build a very strong relationship with them. The old quid pro quo. You know what? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You bring me somebody, I don't care if they're a fugitive or not. As long as you say they are, it doesn't matter. I'm going to get paid, and you're going to get paid by returning this person to the South, to their rightful owner, and you'll pay whatever amount of money they're willing to pay you for returning them, or you could take them and sell them yourself. So people made money on both sides of this. We typically just think of the value of slavery as people getting free labor out of these individuals for the rest of their lives, but there were lots of other people who made tremendous amounts of money as a result of the enslavement of these African men, women, and children. So the Underground Railroad was a path out of slavery, and the path that we generally hear about is the path north to the northern states and then into Canada. And we've been told our entire lives that Canada was a land of freedom. It wasn't. It was not always a land of freedom. It didn't become the land of freedom until the British government outlawed slavery in all of its colonial territories around the world in 1830. So prior to that, you couldn't really go to Canada and expect to live as a free person, because slavery existed there as well. And if you were in the South, I mean, what's in the way in the South? The Gulf of Mexico. I mean, you may be a pretty strong swimmer, but I don't think you're going to swim across the Gulf of Mexico to South America. And even if you did, you'd probably end up on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico in a place that had slavery as well. So escaping to the South was really very difficult. What people typically did when they escaped when they took the southern route, was what they would do is they would steal away on ships in the South that were taking them to other places. Say they may have escaped to places in the Caribbean and kind of blended in and gained their freedom that way. Or they would take a ship that would take them around to the Atlantic Ocean and up to the northern part of the country. So you had these ships that would transport goods and commodities around, and they found ways of sneaking on board those ships, pretending to be a worker on those ships and things of that nature. So the southern route was a route that was possible, but you had to be very, very clever in order to do it. So most people took the northern route. Once they got into those states like Ohio and Illinois, they would encounter people who were very, very strong proponents of giving them that assistance they needed. The Underground Railroad was very strong in those states, and so they would have these conductors, as they called them, that would assist you in getting from place to place. So they would hide you in compartments within their homes or other places. They would give you assistance in terms of giving you food, water, shelter from the weather, things of that nature. And putting you on the path to the next person, the next conductor along the path. So a series of safe houses and conductors who help slaves escape is what the Underground Railroad is. I can remember, I used to teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, and I can remember one lesson, one of the social studies teachers was talking about the Underground Railroad, and many of the students thought that it was a train under the ground. And we had to explain, nah, they didn't really have those back then, and so they didn't have a clue. And so the path to escape included up north or Canada, usually, but sometimes south, as I explained earlier. So when we look at Joshua Glover escaping from St. Louis and making this journey north, he stopped in Racine. There's another interesting story of someone who made it to Wisconsin to kind of gain a sense of freedom, who was headed to Canada. The founder of the museum, Dr. James Cameron, survived a lynching at the age of 16 in Marion, Indiana. As a young man, he became involved in the civil rights movement there. He opened up branches of the NAACP. He began to raise his family there. He married his wife, Virginia. And as a result of the work he was doing on behalf of the NAACP and other civil rights organizations, he got death threats, and he decided after a while, he said, you know what? It's just not worth it anymore. He said, things are not changing. People are not changing. It's time for us to pack up and move to Canada. And that's where he was headed. So he was on his way to Canada, and he was born in Wisconsin, in La Crosse. So he was on his way to Canada to leave America forever in 1952. And he stopped for a short visit in Milwaukee, and he fell in love with the city of Milwaukee, found work, and made it his home for the rest of his life. So he was taking a similar journey in a way to Joshua Glover about 100 years later. And they were both looking to escape servitude in some capacity, the incapacitating nature of the lives that they were living. And I really didn't think about that parallel until I looked at this just a few moments ago. Quick thinking, right? All right, let's move on. So, the first escape is escape from St. Louis. May 15th, 1852, after months of planning and contemplation, he finally escaped. So, typically when people would escape successfully, it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It wasn't something that they just decided at one given moment, I'm going to just start running. They planned it out. In some cases, they were assisted by other enslaved people. Many of the ways that they learned to communicate how to escape was actually through folk tales and actually songs that blacks used to sing. So there were a lot of songs that we refer to now as Negro spirituals. That were actually songs that were used to trick white people into not knowing that they were talking about escaping. And so a lot of these songs and folk tales that they would tell would basically be a way of giving these escapees instructions on how to travel by following the stars, following the North Star, and things of that nature. And so he contemplated this journey for quite a bit of time. He planned it out, and he said, okay, tonight is the night, it's time to go. His owner, Mr. Garland, offered a $200 reward for his return. And so as you kind of study the history of this period of time in American history, you find multitudes of these posters, which were all over the country, talking about these escaped individuals and offering rewards for their return. And so there was a $200 reward for the return of Mr. Glover. After about 7 weeks, he arrived in Racine. So St. Louis to Racine, 7 weeks. Imagine if you took your car to drive to St. Louis to visit friends and relatives and get some of that nice barbecue they have in St. Louis and visit the St. Louis Arch, and that journey took you 7 weeks. I would give you some advice. Get a different car. But it took him 7 weeks to finally make it successfully after many stops along the Underground Railroad. And he was, like many of these people, was able to travel typically 8 to 10 miles a day. And at one point, he couldn't find any food. He was without food, without fresh water for 3 consecutive days. So he was in bad shape there on a number of occasions. Fortunately, people along the Underground Railroad were able to assist these individuals when they were without food and water. And he was fortunate enough that some people assisted him through this journey. So he came to Racine, and he became a member of the city and made friends, and he chose the name Glover because one of his previous owners, a woman by the name of Martha Glover, he liked the name, so he said, okay, I'm going to use that name. Now the man who was chasing him, the man who put the $200 reward on his head, was Mr. Garland, so he chose to give himself the name Glover. And one of the interesting things in U.S. history about blacks in terms of our names that many of us don't know. So in a lot of cases, the names that we have, our last names, are the names of the people who owned our ancestors as enslaved individuals. But one of the fascinating things that happened is when people did escape, they actually decided to give themselves whatever last names they wanted. Because during the days that slavery existed, blacks actually did not have a last name. They weren't given a last name. They were just given a first name. In fact, when you check the U.S. Census Bureau records, from the first census in 1790 all the way through the census in 1860, which was the last one before slavery ended, unless a black person was a free person, you would not find their name in the U.S. Census. They would be counted on what were known as slave schedules. So, for instance, I was able to track down the slave schedule of the man who owned my family in Mississippi, Dempsey Dilts. And so I looked at that document for 1850 and also for 1860. And what it has the name of the owner at the top of the slave schedules. It's part of the Census Bureau records. And underneath, it'll have a list of the African men, women, and children that he owned. And it'll have male or female, and it'll have their age. And that's it. No other details, no names, no date of birth, nothing at all. And so that's one of the things that makes it extremely difficult for us to trace our family history, because we run into that roadblock where unless the person was still living when the 1870 census or later was done, then it's almost impossible to figure out who these people were because they weren't listed by name. And so Joshua Glover decided to give himself a last name, and he chose the name Glover. So he worked at various odd jobs, including a local sawmill here in town, and he, became a productive member of society, made friends, and, was constantly in fear of being, captured. But he lived a fairly normal life, was a well-respected member of the community. As we will see later, people really liked Mr. Glover, and they risked life and limb to help him escape. So for about 2 years he lived in fear of being recaptured and returned to Missouri. So he had 2 years of freedom, but it really was him constantly looking over his shoulder and hoping that this wouldn't happen, but knowing that it could happen at any given moment. He was one of about 100 black residents in Racine in 1852. So as he lived here, about 1% of the population was black, and these were blacks who were living in a free state. So they lived in a condition that was much different than the lives of blacks in the South. And that was part of the reason they came. They came because they could gain a measure of freedom and live a somewhat normal life, just as the whites were doing in the city. And so Mr. Glover came, and he was a resident and an upstanding member of the community. And people said, he's done a good job in these 2 years he's been here. He's a member of the community. We're not going to allow people to treat him otherwise. So a warrant was issued for his arrest. So Mr. Garland arrived in Milwaukee and received a warrant in the local courthouse in Milwaukee. So this warrant gave him permission to go and arrest Joshua Glover. Like I said earlier, he had been tracked by his owner, some men that he hired to track Mr. Glover, and they discovered that he was living in Racine. They went to the courthouse in Milwaukee, they received the warrant, and then made their way to Racine with a posse, including the famous slave catcher of Dover, Daniel Houghton. Now, Daniel Houghton is an interesting man. He was notorious among the enslaved population because he was so good at his job. He was one of the best trackers that there were in the country. He was successful in 80-some-odd% of the cases where he tracked people. He was able to find them. And he made a significant fortune doing that during the course of his life. And so this posse was put together in Milwaukee, and they went on a journey to come to Racine to look for Mr. Glover. So, of course, someone had to double-cross Mr. Glover, as we hear so often in our history. A young man by the name of Nelson Turner, who was also a fugitive from slavery from Natchez, Mississippi, decided to sell Mr. Glover out and tell where he was, and he was paid a small sum of money for that, and he was also given the promise that he wouldn't have to worry about being captured and taken back to Natchez, Mississippi moving forward. They promised him that he would forever be free. So he sold Mr. Glover out, told them where they could find Mr. Glover, and then Garland and Marshal Cotton arrested Glover after a brief struggle on March 11th, 1854. So they found this small cabin he was in. They went, of course, Glover tried to escape. There was a fight. Fist flew in both directions. They overpowered him, and they captured him, and they took him on a very, very odd route to get to Milwaukee. One of the things that made the route so odd was that a huge rainstorm occurred on the day that they captured him, and they got lost trying to make it to the jail in Milwaukee. And so they finally arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning after taking a really, really strange route. If you ever took that route to get from Racine to Milwaukee, somebody would think that you'd been drinking. It was a very strange route, but they were lost. They weren't from the area. Some of the members of the posse were, but they were lost in that storm. So word spread very quickly. So by 9 a.m., Sherman Booth, the editor of the Free Democratic, spread news that Mr. Glover had been captured and that, we should do something about it. And so people he said, wait a minute, this is one of our own. This is a member of our community. And he's been captured, he's been arrested, he's been taken away from us. We need to assist him in some capacity. So word began to spread very, very quickly. Sherman Booth spread the word in his paper, and eventually what happens is that the largest group to ever assemble in Racine met in Haymarket Square. And they met there and with the determination to figure out some way of helping Joshua Glover. They didn't know exactly what they were going to do. They said, we have to help him some way, shape, or form. So let's make this journey to Milwaukee and demand his freedom. And so that's exactly what they did. This large group went to Milwaukee and went outside the jail and demanded Mr. Glover's freedom. And so 100 men were a part of that group that arrived in Milwaukee with a warrant for Garland and Marshal Cotton on assault charges. Because remember, I told you when they captured Mr. Glover, they were fisticuffs and they assaulted Mr. Glover. So they got a court to issue a warrant for their arrest for assaulting Mr. Glover. And so they went to the court with that document. And of course, a local judge issued a writ of habeas corpus, which was ignored by the federal marshals. So these federal marshals said, we don't care what you're saying. We're taking this man where he belongs. He's a fugitive. We're going to take him back to Missouri, regardless of what you idiots say. And of course, the people in Racine were not very happy about that. So a crowd of 5,000 then gathered at the county jail. And they said, you know what? We're going to do something. They broke into the jail and they took him out of the jail. And the people there were not very happy. The people in the jail were not happy that they had broken in, and they took him to what's now called Waukesha, or if you're not from Wisconsin, Waukesha. They took him, it was called Prairieville back at that time. And so they took him there and they allowed him to escape So they took him from Waukesha to Rochester to Racine to Spring Prairie and to Racine because they knew they were being chased. These people were not going to just give up on finding this man. They were going to chase this party that had helped him escape down, and they were going to find Mr. Glover and help him escape. And they said, you know what, we're going to follow these people. So they took this very curious route to help Mr. Glover get back to Racine so that he could gain entry to a ship and get out of town. So this case had huge ramifications. Nationally, the Fugitive Slave Law was abided by pretty much every state. States really didn't argue against it very vociferously at all. It was very rare for anyone to challenge it in court. But Wisconsin was different. Wisconsin said, you know what, we don't agree with this law. So what happens is Garland and his aides were arrested by the sheriff of Racine for assault. So these men who came to arrest Joshua Glover and put him in handcuffs to take him back to St. Louis found themselves in handcuffs and were taken to jail for assaulting Mr. Glover. They received their release on a writ of habeas corpus, and Sherman Booth was arrested along with 2 others charged with helping Glover escape. So here we have Sherman Booth, who spread the word through his newspaper that, you know, they've captured Joshua Glover, we need to assist him. You know, he shouldn't have done that because they came and arrested him and a couple other people for helping Mr. Glover escape. But it just kind of showed you the mindset of the people of Milwaukee and Racine at that time, that they were going to defy these federal marshals, they were going to defy federal law because they thought it was the right thing to do. And I've always argued this with people that, and Dr. Kaplan says this quite often, that in order to really make positive change with these issues we're dealing with, race issues, you have to have the ability to change people's hearts and minds. And so the hearts and minds of the people of Racine who left their community and went all the way to Milwaukee in this large group demanding the freedom of Joshua Glover, these are people whose hearts and minds were in the right place. People who were risking jail and large fines. And so we had this festive atmosphere, which is still celebrated here in Racine. I can remember several years ago, there was a group of us from the museum, when the physical museum was still open, a group of us who came with some young people who we brought down, some students from one of the local schools, and we came down and we had a celebration at the spot where Joshua Glover finally gained his escape from Racine at, and it was very well attended that day. I can remember it was a very warm, sunny day, lots of smiling faces in the crowd, and we took a picture of the entire group, and I don't know whatever happened in the picture. I wish I still had it, but it just kind of showed that even despite what we've been led to believe, that, you know, slavery was something that was believed in by every white person, it simply was not the case. You know, they were the people who were you know, opposed to slavery from the day it was created in this country and fought against it. And I found that Dr. Cameron used to call those white people freedom-loving whites. And you know, there were obviously lots of them in Racine at this particular time who assisted Mr. Glover, made that journey to Milwaukee and broke him out of jail. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court, Booth appealed and received a writ of habeas corpus, because remember, he was arrested for assisting Joshua Glover. So the U.S. Supreme Court, or the Wisconsin Supreme Court, said he was held in federal prison until March 1860 when he was pardoned by President Buchanan. So he was arrested and he was charged with harboring a fugitive from slavery, and he was sent to prison for it. And eventually President Buchanan gave him a pardon. But it shows you the power of this man who was, you know, one of the upstanding members of the community, who, you know, was fairly well compensated for the work that he did, was one of the richer members of the community. He risked all of that for this young man, Joshua Glover, and he paid the ultimate price of going to prison for it. But the U.S. Supreme Court and the Wisconsin Supreme Court differed on how these cases should be handled. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court basically told the U.S. government, that, you know what, we don't really care about the Fugitive Slave Clause. We don't care about the clause in the federal Constitution which says we should return them. We think it's wrong, and we're not going to punish people for doing that. So the final outcome of this, he lived as a free man in Canada until his death, June 3rd, 1888. So this young man escaped in 1854 with the assistance of these freedom-loving whites in Racine and Milwaukee, and he made his way to Canada eventually and lived as a free person there. And in Milwaukee, we have two places where we've actually installed historical markers commemorating the rescue of Joshua Glover. So in Cathedral Square Park, which is where the jail was that he was taken out of, it's no longer there, obviously. In 2001, the Wisconsin Historical Society installed this sign that you see as a historical marker commemorating the rescue of Joshua Glover in Cathedral Square Park. So then in 2005, a mural of Glover's rescue and escape was installed downtown on Fond du Lac Avenue under the I-43 overpass, a former route of the Underground Railroad. So it's interesting that at that particular place where that mural is, you know, if you get off the freeway in Milwaukee on Fond du Lac Avenue, you can't help but to see it. It's a big, beautiful mural. And interestingly enough, the artist that did the mural is actually the same artist who did a painting in the museum. And so when you would go to the physical museum, you would go into the front door, and the first thing you would see is this passageway, this hallway that you would go down, which would be the passageway into our slaving ship. And on the walls of that hallway, you would see the artist's interpretation of an African village. And so this artist who did that mural of the African village in our museum is the same one who they hired to do this memorial to Joshua Glover's escape. It's really, you know, in many ways, it's a fascinating testament to the willpower of people to challenge their own government. You know, this was something that was very difficult to do at that particular time in history. There have been a lot of, you know, violence around the issue of slavery. We all know that, you know, people in Kansas, there was a tremendous amount of debate and violence. People lost their lives in violent struggles and just having a discussion about slavery there. And so these things were going on around the country, and these people in Racine took it upon themselves to become a part of that struggle and to, you know, fight on behalf of this person who they said, you know, this is a member of our community. He's done nothing wrong. We like this young man. He's lived his life the right way since he's been here. And we're going to reach out and assist him in any way we can, because it's just wrong for him to lose his freedom simply because someone wants him back in a condition of servitude. And so it was a big moment in Wisconsin, and we still celebrate to this day. However, it shows that not all was good. So 7 years after Joshua Glover, we had a lynching in Milwaukee. George Marshall Clark, he was one of 16 lynching victims in Wisconsin. He was the only African American to have been lynched in the state, and the only lynching to actually happen within the city of Milwaukee. So let me just give you a little background on lynching. I think people have a misinterpretation of lynching. So the institution of lynching is an old institution. It's been around since the Revolutionary War days. So the term lynching comes from a man by the name of Charles Lynch, who was a justice of the peace in the Revolutionary War days. And this man felt that the laws were way too lenient. So when people would come in his court, he would give them the penalty that was required under the law, and then he would give them extra punishment that he deemed necessary to make them, you know, walk the correct path. So he would do things such as order these people to be whipped publicly, to be tarred and feathered, things of that nature. And that became known as people travel into the frontier as Lynch's Law. And so eventually they began to kill people. And many of the people who were lynched early on, it wasn't really very good idea to lynch blacks at this particular time because they were very valuable to whoever they belonged to. So if you killed a black person who was owned by someone, you would actually have to pay them the value of that individual. So people were not going to just readily kill somebody so that they would have to pay them $600, $700, whatever for that individual. So it was fairly rare for blacks to be lynched. So during this early part of time, because of the lack of proper authorities, people would take the law into their own hands, and they would punish people and eventually kill people. So these vigilante crowds would use lynch's law to punish people and eventually kill people. So if you don't really understand the value of cattle at this time, cattle was a person's livelihood. If they depended on that cattle to plow their fields or to provide the milk and other things for their families, if you took that away from them, that was a capital offense in the eyes of many. And so people would be lynched for cattle rustling, cattle stealing, things of that nature. So these early instances of lynching would be mostly white people. Some Native Americans, occasionally blacks would be as well, but it really wasn't a much of a necessity to do it to blacks because the criminal justice system would simply hand down punishment of death to them. And so people didn't see the necessity in taking the law in their own hands because the criminal justice system would hand out punishments which would lead to death for these blacks. And so as slavery ended, we began to see those violent mobs, these vigilante mobs, actually began to kill primarily blacks, and it really became very, very prominent in the 1880s. So from the 1880s to the 1920s was the heyday of lynching in America. That was when the majority of the documented lynchings occurred. And there were several organizations that kept track of lynching. So there were lynching databases that were kept by several institutions. Tuskegee Institute in Alabama kept track. The Chicago Defender newspaper kept track. And so up until just a couple years ago, the official number of documented lynching cases was about 4,800. Fortunately for us, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a man who came and spoke here last year and spoke very eloquently, Brian Stevenson. He is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and his group did a study. They wanted to go and see if they could find any other cases of lynchings that occurred that weren't documented up to that point. Many of those that were documented because they were in small newspapers and things of that nature. And so his group did an exhaustive study, and in addition to the 4,800 documented lynchings that had already been talked about and known about, they found an additional 700 plus. Throughout the country. And so that makes the official number of known documented lynchings about 5,500 or so. So this lynching, which happened in Milwaukee, was a big event. So this is what happened. So on the evening of Friday, September 6, 1861, Marshall Clark and a friend of his, James Shelton, were walking downtown Milwaukee, and they had the audacity to be walking hand in hand with two white women. And so trouble ensued right away. Two Irishmen, Dabney Carney and John Brady, saw these young men walking with these two young white women, and he made a remark about white women with, well, I'm not going to say it, you can read it. And these two young black men took offense to being called, well, I'm going to say it, damn niggers.
Thank you.
They took offense to this. A fight ensued between the four men, and Shelton pulled out a knife and he stabbed Mr. Carney in the abdomen and slashed Mr. Brady. So he was defending himself. These men attacked him and Mr. Clark, and he was defending himself, and Dabney Carney eventually died from his wounds later the following day. And so you had these two men who were minding their own business, walking down the street with two women that they were, seeing for the evening. They were accosted by these two men who, felt it not right for them to be with these two young women. They attacked these men. They defended themselves, and eventually one of the white men was killed. And so before he died, he identified Mr. Shelton as the man who had stabbed him. So he said, the one who stabbed me was Mr. Shelton. And so news about his death spread very fast, and the Irish population in the city became very angry and decided to take revenge for his death. And so within an hour, a mob gathered and headed down to the jail. And so the police chief, William Beck, and two other patrolmen did everything they could to disperse the crowd, but they were unsuccessful. They punched the chief in the head, knocking him unconscious. And basically the jailer who saw what happened, Mr. William Kendrick, he locked the main door to the cells. And so the mob went and gathered some heavy timber, and they broke into the jail, broke the iron bars. And this is very similar in many ways to the lynching that Dr. Cameron survived. So when the mob came for him and his two friends in the jail in Marion, Indiana, the sheriff tried to prevent them from coming into the jail. He and his deputies were ordered to not allow these mobsters into the jail, a crowd of 15,000 or so. And they were armed, and when they couldn't get into the jail, when they couldn't convince the authorities to let them into the jail, they went to a local foundry in Marion and got some of those big, strong guys who worked with big, heavy sledgehammers daily, and they brought those sledgehammers back and crowbars and other things, and they eventually broke the bricks around the jail door down, and that's how they got into the jail in Marion. So very similar to what happened in Milwaukee. They broke into the jail and eventually got who they were looking for. They beat and dragged Mr. Clark out of the cell and into the street. Now remember, before the man died, he told them that it was Mr. Shelton who had stabbed him. So these people grabbed the wrong man. And so when the crowd reached Buffalo Street, they found a pile driver that would suit their needs, and the end of the rope, which was already attached to his neck, was secured to the top, and at 2:30 a.m. he was shoved off the ladder and left to swing, and his body was left hanging there for another 2 hours. And so this lynching occurred. Mr. Shelton had actually been the one who stabbed Mr. Carney and killed him, had escaped the jail and fled the city. He was captured in Waukesha. I love saying Waukesha. I can remember there was an event that happened in Waukesha years ago, and all of the national media came, and I can remember watching CNN and all of these, non-Wisconsinites were saying, in Waukesha, Wisconsin today. I'm like, can you talk to somebody from here and get the correct pronunciation, please? It's not Waukesha. So anyway, he was captured in Waukesha and rearrested the following Tuesday. So he returned to Milwaukee for trial, and the trial lasted 9 days, and he was found not guilty, that he was acting in self-defense. So imagine this, had this crowd of people who decided to take the law into their own hands allowed the authorities to do their job and to have the criminal justice system work the way it's supposed to work, then Mr. Clark would have never lost his life. In fact, he would have never been even close to losing his life, because obviously the man who died had already testified as to who stabbed him. The facts of the case were very well known, but the mob did not really care about the facts, and they went and they killed the wrong person. And unfortunately, that lynching occurred, and the state of Wisconsin charged 6 men with lynching Marshall Clark. And the trial began November 14th, 1861. And one of the men who was charged had already fled the city. There were 3 days of testimony, and the case was turned over to the jury. After 2.5 days of deliberation, they couldn't reach a final verdict. And the trial for the only lynching in Milwaukee has resulted in a hung jury. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. First of all, how many of you knew that there was a lynching that occurred in Milwaukee prior to this evening? Okay, a couple of you. I think it's the reason that I shared this story with you in association with Joshua Glover is to show you that we can very easily go from one realm to the other. We celebrate the Joshua Glover story and the fact that people stood up on his behalf, and yet we don't know about the Marshall Clark story, which happened, just a few short years after that. So I always want people to understand this about race relations in America. We have to understand the genesis of these race relations. We have to understand how they came about. And regardless of what we've learned in our history classes, Dr. Kaplan was telling me a very interesting story. A young woman who has decided to volunteer with us and told her about her history classes in South Carolina. And this young woman was in high school. It's just a few years ago, 2011, she was in high school. And she told Dr. Kaplan that the history books had everything about slavery cut out. Those pages had been cut out of the history books by the teachers. And so Fran asked her, well, how do you know that the teachers cut those pages out? She says, well, I actually had a book that they forgot to cut the pages out of. And when the teacher saw that those pages were in my book, she grabbed it and she cut the pages out. That was in 2011. So we are still struggling with kind of reconciling these things as a nation, because we've constantly told people for 200 years plus and of freedom and justice and equality and all of these things, but the history shows that just was not the case, even when the founding fathers were saying that it was. And so what I want all of you to kind of leave with this evening, and I'll see if you have questions shortly, is the reason that I talk about these types of issues, the reason I followed in the footsteps of Dr. Cameron, is because I think that all of us have been done an injustice as Americans. All of us. Blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, anyone who's ever lived in this country. Our educational system has done an injustice to us by not teaching us true history. Now, it may be because people are afraid of it, people are ashamed of it, whatever. It doesn't matter why. But what it does is it informs how we see the world. Because if we believe that this country was founded on these principles of freedom and justice and liberty, and we share this with the world all the time, we wave our flag around talking about how wonderful we've been, but we ignore the fact that this just wasn't the case. Slavery was a legal institution. It was supported by the federal government, by state governments, by local governments. Millions of people owned African Americans. Millions of people worked in jobs that supported slavery. The federal government taxed the importation of Africans into the country. So it's a big part of our history, and it created an environment where you had to find a way to justify enslaving these African people. So the justification became this justification that we're stuck with, that these are inferior human beings. They're not like the rest of us. They're not as intelligent as us. Their moral standards are much lower than ours are. They are different than we are. We don't have to respect them. And so that's where all of the stereotypes of African Americans have come from, this racial animosity that exists around our country that has been used very recently during political elections to divide and conquer people. It's part and parcel of what we've done as a nation for a very long period of time. It's not something that you get over by just saying, well, okay, we're going to just pretend these things didn't happen. I do these types of presentations talking about this history because I want you to know the truth. And that informs you as to how we got to where we are today. Without knowing this history in its true form, you are mixed up, you're confused, you have misunderstandings about how we got to where we are. We've been living with this mythology of how America came to be this place with racial problems. The racial problems are a direct result of the enslavement of millions and millions of African men, women, and children, and the legacies that is left in the lives of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, like myself, as well as the lives of whites. The benefits that whites accrued, but more importantly, the benefits that the nation itself accrued. Okay. Sorry about the humming. I want to just share this one last thing with you, because I think this is the most important thing to understand about the institution of slavery. Regardless of what you've been told, slavery was the engine that led to the Industrial Revolution. Were it not for the free labor of Africans and the cotton and rice and tobacco and sugar cane and indigo and all of these other products that they picked out of the ground for free, not just here in the United States, but all throughout the Caribbean, all throughout South America, were it not for that free labor and those products, there would have been no Industrial Revolution. People tend to forget that the Industrial Revolution had to have some type of mechanism that drove it. The mechanism that drove it was the money that was generated as a result of these people working for free, creating these products, building the White House, building the U.S. Capitol building, building levees, building canals, building railroads, building bridges, tearing down forests to build cities. All these things these African people contributed, not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. And it enriched the United States and it enriched Europe in a way that they had never been enriched before. And that is a legacy of slavery. That's the true legacy of slavery. We would not have the industrial might that we have. We would not have the wealth. The wealthiest place in the United States of America today is the northeast part of the country. And it's that way because it's always been the wealthiest part of the nation. The main reason it was the wealthiest because when slavery was going on in the southern states, all of the original 13 colonies had slavery on the books at one time. The northern states eventually grandfathered it out, and they didn't need it anymore because what they did is they recognized that, well, we don't have the cash crops in the north. We have something even better than the cash crops. We have the factories. We can take the cotton and turn it into textiles. We have the places where we can take the sugar cane and turn it into molasses and eventually rum. We have the places where we can produce rice and sell it to people. We can use the indigo and turn clothing into the colors that we choose. Those factories were running and churning during the days of enslavement in the northeast. Banking and insurance became huge as a result of that. People invested in the journeys of these slave ships. You can invest, just like you go and you could buy stock in Google or Apple or Walgreens or whatever. You could buy stock in these ships that transported these African men, women, and children across the seas. Insurance companies made tremendous amounts of money because people purchased insurance policies, not just for the lives of the Africans, but in case they were injured. So if you had an African who was a carpenter and he injured his right arm and he couldn't use it anymore, you had an insurance policy to cover that loss. So it was a huge, huge business, and it led to the wealth that we see today, because when the Civil War began, 41% of the wealth in the southern states was actually wealth in the ownership of black men, women, and children. 41% of their wealth. So guess what happens? Someone comes and threatens to take that population from you. They're not just taking your free labor force from you, they're taking your wealth from you. And I tell people all the time, we can argue about the causes of the Civil War and people can keep talking about this nonsense about states' rights. It was states' rights to be slave or free states. That's what the whole states' rights thing was about. If you want to know why the Civil War happened, all you have to do is Google the secession documents of those 11 states that broke away from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. They tell you in very clear, articulate terms why they broke away. The great state of Mississippi, the state I was born in, they said in no uncertain terms that slavery is the engine that drives our economy. They said that in their secession papers. So we have to understand that we have what we have today as a nation. The industrialized West in Europe, Canada, United States, they have what they have because of the wealth that was generated by the enslavement and servitude of African people, millions of them. And so we have to keep that in mind, and it helps us to understand how we got to this particular place. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Do we have any questions, comments? Yes?
I have a question about those commissioners. How did you get to be a commissioner? Was it a local office or?
Yeah, basically, in many small communities, you didn't have a formal criminal justice system. They were typically in like the county seats, the bigger cities within those communities. So if you were in a small rural community, you had people who were basically working as court commissioners. So they would actually do the paperwork in that town and send it to the community where the court system actually was. So they, it wasn't a great job, it wasn't a very important job, but that law empowered them to actually act as if they were judges.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Yes.
On your map of the Underground Railroad, it looked like it went across Lake Michigan.
Yes.
So how did they do that? Because it's a big lake.
Yeah, well, there were typically a couple methods of getting to Canada. The shortest method was to go to Detroit and cross in Detroit. Right. Very short journey, right? But people who came from Wisconsin and Illinois who took that route would actually take boats across Lake Michigan. And so several years ago, my wife and I had the pleasure with my daughter of going up to Mackinac Island. Beautiful island. I mean, we had a wonderful time there. That was one of the routes that people used to take. They would take a boat up to Mackinac, and if you know where Mackinac is, it's really you can look for Mackinac. It's right where Lake Michigan and Lake Superior meet up, and there's a very, very long bridge, a big, beautiful bridge which connects United States to Canada there. That was one of the routes that they would take. So if they went the lake route, they would either go up that way to get into Canada, or they would take the route and go down into Upper Michigan to get to Detroit and then cross over there. Yes, ma'am.
To that question, what kind of passage was it? Because the Underground Railroad was pretty secretive. The boats had to be kind of secretive too, right? If they were transporting.
Yeah, one of the hidden parts of the Underground Railroad were actually the transportation vehicles they used. So people who were proponents of the Underground Railroad were people who owned boats, and they would have compartments on the boat where they would sneak a person on in the middle of the night and hide them on that boat for their journey. And another tool that they use, and this was used in the South as well when they escaped to the places in the Gulf Coast, they would actually hire these people as crew members of the boats. And so they could freely roam around the boat, and people just think, oh, he's just another sailor on the boat. So there were mechanisms they used. They were very clever. Because they knew that there would constantly be people on the lookout wherever boats were leaving, because they knew that those are some of the routes that people took. But it was one of those things where people learned how to get away from these people who were fugitive catchers, and they were very clever about it. Yes, sir.
How would they go about tracking a slave? It seems to me that they didn't have an internet in those days. I would think it would be very hard to document and prove that this individual had escaped from my plantation in the South.
Well, it actually became a science. So most of the blacks who did escape, they didn't make it very far. They would typically make it less than 10 miles before they were captured. They would have the bloodhounds out searching for them. So there were very few that would have the wherewithal to make the full journey as Joshua Glover did. So they would track them with dogs, and they would also have people who knew that there were rewards on their heads, and they could very easily get that reward if they turned this person in. So a person like Joshua Glover, who came to Racine, people had probably heard that people were coming to this region to escape, and so this man who captured him, who I told you about, was one of the best at his business. He had people around the country in different places that were actually on the lookout for people, and were able to help identify people. And so they would very cleverly go into communities and just kind of question, who's that black guy? 1% of the population is 100 black people in town. It's very easy for you to question, how long has this guy been here? Has he been here 10 years, 5 years, how long? And so they would use interrogation methods, and they were very sneaky about it. And they would offer people money as well to give them information. And so typically if they made it that far and the people captured them, it was usually because of this network of compatriots they had developed over the course of time. So Mr. Houghton, who was the one who actually found Mr. Glover, had a network all over the Midwest, in Chicago and Racine and Milwaukee, as far away as Detroit, a network of people who assisted him, and he paid them very, very well. He was very well paid because he had such a high rate of capturing people, and so it was very easy to flash a significant amount of money, or flash this reward poster. Hey, you can get $200 to turn this man in. Money talks. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I hesitate to ask this, but it's boiling within me. Whoever came up with the first idea that we would take black people and make them slaves, why didn't they go to Australia and say we'll take all Australians and make them? Where did that start? That the black person was going to be the slave?
That is a great question. So let's go back in history a little way. So,
Could you repeat it?
yeah, she asked why black people were selected as slaves. Why didn't they go to a place like Australia or someplace similar? Why did black people become the enslaved population here? So we have to go back to the 1400s. So during the 1400s, as Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages, they began to traverse the world and do business, traveling across the mountains, traveling into Asia, and they began to do a lot of business with places in the East Indies, China, Japan, places of that nature. So these journeys, these journeys to do trade were very, very expensive, tremendously expensive. So what they were trying to do was to find a cheaper way to get to those places. And so Prince Henry the Navigator, the leader of Portugal, gave this challenge. He said, we want someone to try to go around Africa in a ship and see if it's a shorter journey going around Africa. Nobody really knew how big Africa was at the time, but they knew that they could try to at least make it around. So what happened for many years, Portuguese ships would travel down the west coast of Africa, and they encountered a particular place in the ocean where the seas were just horrible, very treacherous, and most ships that took that path, they were overcome by the seas, and the people were never heard from again. So in 1441, a Portuguese ship actually decided to take that journey but make a detour and go a little bit further west into the Atlantic Ocean to avoid those treacherous waters. They made it around that place where all these other ships had crashed, and they landed in a place called Cape Bojador, which is in northwestern Africa today. And they went into a village and they kidnapped a group of 10 Africans. They took those Africans back to Prince Henry the Navigator as a gift. And so that began the beginnings of Africans being taken out of West Africa by Europeans, and they were sold to wealthy people like the Pope. Only the wealthiest were allowed to have these servants, as they called them. They were slaves, but they called them servants. And so that began the relationship between Europe and West Africa. And so as they began to gather the resources to travel further down the coast of West Africa, they began to build relationships, trading relationships with the people of West Africa. And eventually, Columbus in 1492 mistakenly ran into what they call the New World. We all heard the same lie. Columbus discovered America. You can't discover a place where millions and millions of people are living already. Let me show you how I can prove that you can't discover a place. Anybody here have a really nice TV at home? Like a big screen? You look like you have a big screen, sir. I know you do.
42 inches.
Okay, yeah. Okay, who has a nice man cave at home? Or a woman cave? Okay, you got a nice man cave. So imagine this, sir. Tonight, when you leave and you go back to your home, I'm going to beat you to your house. I'm going to stop at some nice restaurant, give me a nice meal. I'm going to come into your house. I'm going to have that food spread out on the table in your man cave. I'm going to get a nice cold beverage out of your refrigerator. And I'm going to be sitting there watching something on ESPN this evening, right? You're going to come into the house, you're going to say, what in the heck are you doing in my house? Reggie Jackson. I'll say, hey, this isn't your house. I discovered this house. How ridiculous does that sound, right? But that's what Columbus did. He was lost. He was trying to make it to the East Indies, to China and Japan to do trade. And he thought he was in the Indies. He referred to the people as Indies. That's where the name Indians comes from, because he was lost. So when he did this, and he made several subsequent journeys back to the New World, still thought he was in the East Indies, they began immediately to enslave the indigenous population. So the Arawak Indians, Taino Indians, the Carib Indians were enslaved immediately by the Spanish and eventually the Portuguese. And so a man came along who felt that the Indians were being treated very, very poorly. His name was Bartholomew de la Casa. He became a Catholic bishop, and he became the patron saint of the Indians. He's held in high regard by the indigenous people of the Americas, because he spoke out on behalf of ending the enslavement of these people. So he made a suggestion. He said, well, you know, we've been transporting Africans and selling them in the marketplaces of Europe for 50 years now. Why don't we just bring some of them over here and replace the indigenous people as the slaves? And so the Pope listened to him, and leaders of Europe said, that's a good idea. And in the early 1500s, they began to transport Africans as a replacement labor force for the indigenous population. So the indigenous population ended up not being a very good labor force because, well, they could escape very easily because they knew the islands and other places they could live very well. They died off from the manual labor that they weren't accustomed to. And then European diseases wiped out large swaths of their population. So the Africans became the replacement labor force as a result of Bartholomew de la Casa. And de la Casa apologized later. He said that was wrong. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said that. But it didn't matter if he said it or not. Eventually it was going to happen because Africans had been transported and sold in slave markets in Europe for many years prior to that. So that's how the Africans came to be this enslaved population in the United States, in Canada, and Mexico, and Guatemala, and Colombia, and Brazil, and Haiti, and Jamaica, and all of these places where you go on vacation to the Caribbean, and you have these wonderful times on these tropical islands, and you see black people. They came over the same way my people came over, the same ships. In fact, the first Africans to arrive in what's now the present-day United States in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, they were actually captured by a British pirate ship. They were on their way to Cuba to be sold in Cuba from west coast of Africa and Angola. They were transported and they were captured by two British pirate ships. We watch the Pirates of the Caribbean is coming out soon, right? And we celebrate these pirate movies. All these pirates are great guys and just swashbuckling heroes and stuff. We never hear about the fact that these pirates would take whatever booty was available. In many cases, the booty would be the Africans who were on these slaving ships. So the first Africans who arrived in the United States in 1619 were taken by pirates, and that pirate ship eventually ran low on food and water, and they sold those group of Africans to the people in Jamestown, Virginia, because they were about to starve. And so that's how blacks came to be the enslaved population in the New World. Only about 3% of the Africans transported during the transatlantic slave trade came to the United States. 40% went to Brazil. They were the largest slave colony in the world. And if you look at Brazil today, they have the largest African ancestors population outside of Africa of any nation on the planet. There are about twice as many Afro-Brazilians as there are African Americans in the United States of America. If you took all the Afro-Brazilians out of Brazil, took them back to Africa, gave them their own country, they would become the second most populous country on the continent of Africa. The only country that would have a larger population would be Nigeria. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Well, I was going to make a comment that at one point there was a counter trade in the Bahamas and such, where they would be taking American Indians and sending them as slaves there where they would stand out and they had no place to go, and they were taking blacks from there and sending them to the United States for slaves because they stood out and couldn't go anyplace.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the tricks of the trade, was to take people places that made it very difficult for them to escape, because they stood out from the crowd. And you know, one of the things that we have to understand about this slavery that occurred for all of these hundreds of years, really the first Africans arriving in this part of the world in the early 1500s, that trade of Africans continued until Brazil outlawed slavery in 1888. They were the last nation to outlaw slavery. And so you look at all of that long history, and what happens is, because it's a business, people develop scientific methods to run their businesses. And so they study things like you said. They study the population. So the only two groups that have ever been legally enslaved in the United States of America are Native Americans and blacks. Some people will try to tell you that white Irishmen were enslaved. That's nonsense. It never happened. It was against the law to enslave Christians unless they were non-white. So many Europeans came over as indentured servants, but indentured servitude was a system that was basically a free ticket to the New World, to begin a new life. Now, in many respects, though, it was a very horrible journey. The passage from Europe to the United States was nearly as horrific as it was on some of those slaving ships, because these people weren't treated very well. In many cases, cities like London, they would kidnap young children and force them to come to the United States. Now, they would sign this indenture contract, these white people. They would come and they would have to work 4 to 7 years to gain their freedom. But once they gained their freedom, they were good to go. They were, in many cases, given a piece of land. But before their servitude was over, they had the ability to escape. They would just blend in. It's just another white guy, another white woman. They would escape very easily because they would blend in. They would move to a neighboring town. And so blacks, Native Americans didn't have the benefit of that. Yes, sir.
You able to speak on how you mentioned that Africans were brought over as a slave, as a labor force, and how that correlates to today with mass incarceration and the pandemic?
Yeah, so he's asking how that enslavement of Africans brought over as a labor force, how is that connected to mass incarceration today? I would highly recommend that each of you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. How many of you guys have read the book? If you haven't, it should be mandatory reading for every American. What she does is she draws the parallels between the enslavement of Africans, Jim Crow segregation, and then mass incarceration today. And she draws a straight line between the three, because this is kind of what happens. The Africans were brought here simply as a labor force. There was no other reason for the Africans to be here. They didn't bring them here so that they could, play basketball or football or baseball or dance for us and sing and rap. They didn't bring the Africans here for that. They brought them here simply to have these people work for free. Now, that was the value that the Africans had. Now, when slavery ended, the value of the Africans was still as laborers, because even though official slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, which said that slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal from this day forward, it said except as a punishment for a crime you've been convicted of. So what they did is they used that clause of the 13th Amendment to re-enslave blacks by using a system that they put in place, which is called the convict lease system. So the convict lease system meant that if you were a black person and you just randomly walking, any white person could say, "You owe me money," take you to court, and if you couldn't pay the money that you supposedly owed this white person, guess what? You're going to have to work for them to pay that debt off. So what happens is a lot of factories began to use them. One of the biggest users of this was a company called Pratt Mines in Birmingham, Alabama. This huge steel company in Birmingham. They use this system.
May I have your attention, please? The public library is closing promptly at 8 o'clock. If you have any materials to check out or internet copies to pay for, please do so now. Also, internet terminals will shut down at 7:55. Thank you.
Yeah, so they used this convict lease system to re-enslave blacks, and that system was in effect really all the way through the 1930s. So even though slavery ended, it still existed. There's a great book about that. I can't remember the author's name, but it was called Slavery by Another Name. Another book I highly recommend, Slavery by Another Name. So after Jim Crow segregation ended, one of the things that happened during Jim Crow segregation were felon disenfranchisement laws, which prevented blacks from having a right to vote. Blacks throughout the country lost their right to vote, beginning primarily in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. And so here we are, a group that reaches what was known as the nadir in the early 1900s, where we got to a place where we really weren't needed as much anymore because they began to mechanize agricultural work in the South, which is where a majority of blacks live. So now blacks weren't needed again. They began to leave, and they fled the violence of Jim Crow and lynching to go to places like Milwaukee and Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and all these other places. And they began to work primarily as a result of World War I. Jobs were available. Then World War II came. They were available again. And so what happens is we're needed once again. But then all of those things go away, and we get to a place in the late 70s, early 80s where these factories began to close. And well, guess what? We don't need black people anymore to work in these places because they're packing up and leaving anyway. So we fall into this place, in this condition where the cities begin to deteriorate where we live. We begin to lose jobs. Our unemployment rate just goes through the roof. We had one of the worst recessions in U.S. history in 1981-82. Massive numbers of people around the country lost their jobs, primarily blacks. Shortly thereafter, with this massive loss of jobs, you had the drug trade come into our communities, and you have Congress and houses, legislatures around the country began to pass very strict drug laws. So mandatory minimum laws, things of this nature, leads to mass incarceration. We went from having 300,000 people incarcerated in 1970 to having 2.3 million incarcerated 2 years ago. It's down to 2.2 million now. But I suspect that with Jeff Sessions in charge, it's going to go back up again. So that's kind of the journey, but you should read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It does a very, very good job of articulating exactly how those things are tied together. That was a great question, sir. Thank you.
Because it also brings out the point of for-profit prisons as well.
Yeah, I want to just mention that very quickly. There's misinterpretation among people about private prisons. If you look at the 2.2 million people incarcerated in state and federal prisons around the country, only about 15% are in private prisons. The other 85% are in publicly run prisons, the ones that we pay for, right? But there is a sneaky new private prison that's not called a private prison, and most people are completely unaware that it's a prison. This is what's happened. States have found it very, very difficult to pay for the upkeep of prisons, to keep prisons doors open, right? And that's part of the reason that the prison population has dropped, because people say, it's too expensive to keep these people. So what they've done is they've actually begun to use a new form of private prison, but not call it that. They're actually taking people who are in prison and they're leasing space in local jails and sending these people to local jails. And people don't have a clue that people that are in the local jail, which usually in the local jail, if you commit a crime that requires a punishment of less than a year, you'll spend that time in the local jail. If it's over a year, you typically go to a state or federal prison. But now, these local jails are housing people who have 10, 15, 20-year sentences. Those are the new private prisons. Those are the ones that nobody is talking about, and those are going to overtake those real private prisons at some point. Yes, ma'am.
Just to add on to that, they in the paper you just read that they're closing the Green Bay prison, which is like huge. And what they're doing is they're leasing a prison up the street. It's still run by the state, but it's leased to built at least from a private company.
Yeah. So I want to thank you all once again, all of you familiar faces. I love to see you guys when I come down. And if you have time, Dr. Kaplan is very happy and willing and able to accept donations to our cause, America's Black Holocaust Museum. And that donation can be in the form of purchasing a book. If you'd like to purchase a book, I wrote the afterword for it. I'd be happy to sign the book for you as well. Thank you.